Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. I cannot even begin to estimate the number of documentary hours, article column inches or book pages that have been dedicated to discussing Henry VIII's character and the motivation or motivations for his actions throughout his life and reign. There are so many facets to this discussion. There are so many ways into an investigation like this. However, one of them might be to take a look at the people who shaped him, those who were there during his childhood, for example, his family, his friends, his servants, but also, I think, his tutors. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world. I'm currently using Babbel to learn French. Now, I did not do well at this subject in school. In fact, I chose to do Spanish instead of French for my exams because I'd convinced myself that Spanish would be more useful to me. Well, the joke is most certainly on me because my husband did most of his secondary school education in France. He is a fluent French speaker. Half his family still live in France. Some of them have French as their first language. So it turns out that for me, French is in fact personally useful.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Salut, ça va?
Salut, ça va? But it's also professionally useful for me too. As I mentioned in my video on Catherine of Valois, I wasn't comfortable reading that section from Shakespeare's Henry V because it was in French, and I'm embarrassed by my French pronunciation skills. There are also primary source documents in French that I would very much like to be able to read without having to constantly refer to my French dictionary. I love the fact that Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers and that live classes are an option. Babbel is set up to help you use your chosen language, or indeed languages, to have practical conversations in situations that you might actually encounter. Babbel offers users a few different subscriptions. They even have a lifetime subscription. To start using Babbel yourself, please click the link in my description box, and that will allow you to get 60% off of your subscription to Babbel. Thanks again to Babbel for sponsoring this video. But now it's time for us to discuss the life and legacy of Henry VIII's tutor, John Skelton. John Skelton's place and date of birth are not known for sure. We do not know who his parents were or the course of his early years. His biographer, John Scattergood, writes that Skelton, quote, may have been born about 1460 in the north of England, possibly Yorkshire. Skelton attended the University of Cambridge, but we do not know which college or what, indeed, if any, qualifications he managed to obtain during his time there. In around 1490, William Caxton, who is an individual that I think requires his own video on this channel, so do watch this space for that. William Caxton wrote of, quote, Master John Skelton, who had been, quote, late created Poet Laureate in the University of Oxford. 1488 has been suggested as the possible date in which Skelton received this award. In around 1492, according to another contemporaneous work, Skelton was similarly honoured by the University of Louvain, and then again by the University of Cambridge in 1493. Mary C. Flannery provides useful additional context for these achievements, writing, quote, as Skelton's modern biographers have noted, these titles reflected an academic achievement in rhetoric rather than what early humanists or modern readers would understand by either poet or laureate. He would be praised by his colleagues and contemporaries. William Caxton commended Skelton's learning, his skill as a translator, and his, quote, polished and ornate terms. while in 1499 the famed scholar Erasmus described Skelton as, quote, a light and glory of English letters. The talents that Skelton evidently displayed would, however, not only bring him the recognition of his fellow scholars in the universities, they would also, seemingly, mark him out for royal preferment too. It has been suggested that at around the point of his Oxford laureation, Skelton would be given a, quote, habit to wear by King Henry VII. This habit took the form of a robe in green and white, these being the Tudor colours. This robe had the word Calliope embroidered upon it. In Greek mythology, Calliope is the muse of eloquence and of heroic poetry. It has been suggested that Skelton may have entered royal service at around the point of him getting this habit, so that means as early as 1488 he had begun to serve the Tudors. It is, however, unclear what his precise roles or responsibilities would have been at court at this point. He would go on to create a celebratory text, designed to mark Prince Arthur becoming Prince of Wales in 1489. This work carried the title Prince Arthuris Creation. It is thought that this was most likely a poetic work. Unfortunately, though, this title is all that we have, as the text itself is no longer extant, so we can't be sure. A few years later, Skelton would celebrate Prince Arthur's brother, Prince Henry, being created Duke of York, which happened on the 1st of November 1494. Skelton wrote a Latin epigram, Ad tanti principis majestatem, which was thus addressed to Prince Henry's great majesty. Within a couple of years, Skelton was appointed to be the tutor of Prince Henry, who was at that point the spare to his elder brother Prince Arthur, who was the heir. Skelton would remain in this tutoring post until around 1402 or 1403. Tracy Borman writes that, quote, despite his impressive credentials, Skelton was something of a controversial choice. Stridently self-confident, he was opinionated, outspoken, and bursting with ideas, humour, languages, and verse. As such, he presented a stark contrast to the more sober tutors usually favoured by the royal family. Clearly, Skelton was proud of the part he played in educating this prince. He would write some years later how, quote, the honour of England I learned to spell, in dignity royal that doth excel. Note and mark well this parcel. I gave him drink of the sugared well, of Helicon's waters crystalline, acquainting him with the Muses 9. It cometh thee well me to remord that creancer was to thy sovereign lord. It pleaseth that noble Prince Royal me as his master for to call, in his learning primordial. By the time Skelton was creating this poem, his former pupil was already the King of England, and Skelton was enjoying his royal favour. Over a decade before King Henry VIII took the throne, so in 1498, while Skelton was still the prince's tutor, Skelton took holy orders. He was ordained as a priest on the 9th of June in that year. John Skelton explains that Skelton, quote, was attached to the Abbey of St Mary of Graces, a free chapel royal near the Tower of London. King Henry VII attended a mass that was led by Skelton in the November of 1498, and while there, the king made an offering of 20 shillings, which was, reportedly, around 3 times what he would usually offer. In addition to these priestly duties and the responsibilities that he continued to have with regard to educating Prince Henry, Skelton would continue with his own translations and also with the production of his own original writings. The texts that he generated had a fairly broad focus. In them, he explored the business of government. He presented instructions for living a moral life. He wrote some fairly salacious poetry, dealing with seduction, sex workers, and the lusts and ambitions of courtiers as he saw them. But he also produced a set of specific instructions that were clearly intended for the prince that he was teaching. A copy of his princely advice manual, called the Speculum Principis, does survive. The first version of this Latin work was completed at Eltham Palace on the 28th of October 1501. In English, the title of this document reads as A Mirror for Princes, with the rhyming prose found within asserting that it was intending to teach princes in their minority. Prince Henry was, at this time, only a few months shy of his 10th birthday. Skelton would produce another copy of this text, which he would then present to Henry at some point after 1509. And by that time, an awful lot had changed for Skelton's student. On the 2nd of April 1502, Prince Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died. The 10-year-old Prince Henry was now the king in waiting. A few weeks later, on the 29th of April 1502, there is a record that the schoolmaster of the Duke of York, which is what Prince Henry was, had been granted 40 shillings by King Henry VII. It is suggested that the schoolmaster in question here was John Skelton, and that this represented the last payment he would receive as Prince Henry's tutor. Perhaps we should view this change in Skelton's place, in his loss of this particular role, as a response to the alteration in his charge's status. Because Prince Henry's education was going to have to shift up a gear, and it was going to have to rapidly make up for lost time. For the last 10 years, he had been raised as the second son, to be a future subject for his elder brother, who would be the king. But now, those who were responsible for Henry had to prepare him for kingship. For whatever reason, it would seem that Skelton was not considered for this particular task. However, I don't think that we should necessarily read this as Skelton experiencing a total fall from royal favour. Because from the 10th of April 1504 at the latest, Skelton was the rector of the parish church of St Mary the Virgin in Diss in East Anglia. He may have been preferred to this living through the patronage of the king's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. And if this was the case, that leaves me to wonder, had Skelton managed to charm the entire family? This parish church represented a good living for Skelton, and the extant reports show that he did fulfil his responsibilities to that church as befitted a member of the clergy. Nevertheless, it does seem that he wasn't particularly happy out in Diss. It appears that he was very keen to pursue his other interests. He would continue to write, and when an opportunity arose for him to absent himself, he would take it. He would nevertheless continue to hold on to his claim to this post and to the money it brought in for the rest of his life. Prince Henry acceded to his father's throne in 1509, and before long, Skelton was deploying his tried and tested method for obtaining royal favour and preferment. It was, after all, a method that I think had worked for him in the 1480s and 90s, when he was writing those celebratory poems to both Prince Arthur and Prince Henry's honour. Not long after that, he was, of course, made royal tutor to Prince Henry. His method was to write about the royals in favourable ways. A laud and praise made for our sovereign lord the king is thought to have been produced to coincide with the coronation of King Henry VIII. This work by Skelton made much of Henry as being the physical manifestation of the end of the conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. He was the embodiment of the red and white Tudor rose. The text is filled with hope for the just ruler that this author expected his new king to be. By 1509, Skelton was being described as, quote, late of Diss, Norfolk, which does suggest that he was no longer resident in the location where he held his ecclesiastical office and was instead living somewhere else, at least for some of the time. So we might question, had he by this point moved to London? Was he perhaps following the court? Did he maybe have rooms at court? Within a few years, Skelton was referring to himself as Orator Regus, meaning royal speaker. Scattergood states that this most likely means, quote, that he saw himself as a spokesman for the king with a range of duties, sometimes diplomatic, sometimes secretarial, and sometimes poetical. When Henry VIII led his troops into France in 1513, Skelton was able to get updates on the outcomes of sieges and battles with surprising speed. Even if all of it wasn't completely accurate, he used it nevertheless to create celebratory works about English victories. This has led some to conclude that Skelton might have accompanied his king to war on this occasion, that he was there to create this celebratory record, while others believe that he was in fact back in England and that it had been ordered that he should receive these regular reports. Skelton would also write of the English victory against the Scottish troops at the Battle of Flodden. On top of these works of national praise and significance, Skelton also produced more local, personal works. It seems, in fact, that he had scores to settle. A series of his, in Latin, was dedicated to attacking the breeding, behaviour, looks, conduct and career of a wealthy East Anglian knight called Sir Christopher Garnesh. He had been made a gentleman usher to the king in 1509. This knight's supporters then attacked Skelton on paper in return. Skelton's work, called Against Venomous Tongues, which dates from around 1515 to 1516, was an attack on malicious individuals at Henry's court, or at least those that Skelton had come to deem to be malicious. Presumably, they were having some kind of disagreement with him. In May 1519, an event known as the expulsion of the minions occurred. This was when the King's Council moved against a collection of young men that King Henry had raised in favour. He had placed them in his privy chamber and rewarded them with a series of frankly made-up roles within those rooms. The council had come to see them as being a costly group who also were a bad influence. They, or at least enough of them, wanted them dismissed. Against the backdrop of these machinations, Skelton would write his morality play called Magnificence. I do have my own connection to this particular play because I referred to it, made mention of it, in my doctoral thesis. In that project, I pointed out that Skelton's play contains the earliest extant use of the word trash to mean something of, quote, little or no worth or value. In the play, Magnificence is mocked by crafty conveyance for the loss of, quote, his plate of silver and such trash. This play focuses on the governance of a prince's household, specifically of Magnificence's household. This prince, Magnificence, dismisses good counsellors, like his steward, Measure, and allows disloyal, deceptive and evil ones to rise up in his place. This leads this prince to lose his wealth and status, and all looks very bleak. That is until 4 virtuous characters appear to set the prince and his court back on their proper track. I think it's interesting that when Henry's council sought to move against his minions, they were also working to ensure that, quote, 4 sad and ancient knights should be put into the king's privy chamber, presumably to act as a better influence upon him. It is thought that Skelton's play Magnificence was staged at court in 1519 or 1520, so that is while all of this jockeying for position and influence was still very fresh, or indeed still ongoing. And so I do find myself wondering whether Skelton was inspired to produce this play through his own concerns about his former pupil. Was he worried about the way that he was starting to live? Or is it perhaps the case that this creative undertaking was instead inspired by some external force? Was it perhaps motivated by a suggestion from a member of the King's Council, maybe somebody who had come to view those minions as a particular problem? It is interesting, I think, that Thomas Wolsey is often named as one of the prime drivers for this anti-minion action. Is it possible that Wolsey approached his fellow clergyman Skelton and asked for his help to create some artistic means of persuading the young king? Maybe. If this is how it all played out, then this Wolsey-Skelton allegiance must have been very short-lived, because from 1521, Skelton directed 3 clerical satires against the mounting power and influence of Thomas Wolsey. The reference to Wolsey is certainly more veiled in the first of these, called Speak Parrot, from 1521. This text complains about Wolsey's overweening and controlling behaviour during the Anglo-French peace negotiations of 1521. In Colin Clout, which was produced in around 1521 or 22, Skelton complains about the churchmen who ignore their clerical duties for the pursuit of worldly luxury and power. We think that Thomas Wolsey was building his fabulous palace of Hampton Court at around this point, so it does seem that Skelton's attack is more thinly veiled here. It's also arguably more hypocritical, because where is John Skelton? He doesn't appear to be at his ecclesiastical post in this, does he? Rather, he is following the king and his court, interested by that most worldly and luxurious of places. By late 1522, the veil attempting to cover Skelton's complaints about Wolsey has been discarded completely. In his poem, Why Come Ye Not to Court, one section reads as follows: Once yet again, of you I would frame. Why come ye not to court? To which court? To the King's Court or to Hampton Court? Nay, to the King's Court. The King's Court should have the excellence, but Hampton Court hath the preeminence. And York's Place, with my Lord's grace, to whose magnificence is all the confluence, suits and supplications, embassades of all nations, straw for law canon, or for the law common, or for law civil, it shall be as he will. Stop at Lord Tancrete, an abstract or a concrete, be it sour, be it sweet, his wisdom is so discreet that in a fume or an heat, warden of the fleet, set him fast by the feet, and of his royal power, when him list to lower, then have him to the Tower. Sans alter remedy, have him forth by and by to the Marshalsea, or to the King's Bench. He diggeth so in the trench of the Court Royal that he ruleth them all. So he doth undermine, and such slights doth find, that the King's mind by him is subverted, and so straitly coarcted, in credencing his tales, that all is but nutshells that any other saith, he hath in him such faith. These works did not appear in print until after Wolsey died, but presumably they did circulate in manuscript before this, and so perhaps Wolsey saw them, or at least knew of their contents. But equally, perhaps not. Could it be that Skelton did not feel that he had been sufficiently rewarded for his labours with the play Magnificence? Did this cause him to effectively switch his factional allegiance so that he could court favour with Wolsey's enemies at court? Is it possible that he was even seeking the patronage of some or one of the expelled minions who were already drifting back into Henry's privy chamber by the time that Skelton was writing these works? If this is the case, by the time that Skelton's Garland of Laurel was being published in 1523, the situation does appear to have reversed itself once more, because Skelton dedicates this work to, quote, His Most Serene Royal Majesty, together with the Lord Cardinal, the Most Honourable Legate a Latere, etc. If we were looking for some explanation for this sudden display of affection, it might perhaps come in the rest of the dedication, where Skelton also writes as follows: Go, book, fall before the great King Henry VIII and worship him, re-echoing his glories. Greet likewise with reverence the great Cardinal, Legate a Latere, and may he be mindful to sue for the prebend, which he promised to entrust to me some day, and give me grounds to hope for his protection. Between hope and fear. So does this perhaps indicate that Wolsey had promised Skelton a new place, and thus the two men had come to some kind of terms? Perhaps. Or maybe Skelton has simply changed his mind and decided that in fact Wolsey did more good than harm to his king and his country. Scattergood points out that, quote, after 1523 most of his, meaning Skelton's, poems appear to have been commissioned by Wolsey. John Skelton died on the 21st of June 1529. This was just a few months before his enemy turned patron Thomas Wolsey experienced his spectacular fall from favour. When I look at the life of John Skelton, when I think about the facts, at least as far as we know them, I do find myself considering that he may well have been teaching King Henry VIII valuable lessons long after he ceased to be officially in charge of that young man's education. And he may have been doing so without his knowledge. I think that if Henry was paying attention, he would have seen through Skelton's behaviour the value and draw of court factions. Henry could draw his own conclusions about what motivated factions to form and what might cause people to both take and switch sides. He would have seen how ambition might be a motivator as much as personal bonds, feelings, or even ethics. He would also have surely spotted that when these factions were busy tearing each other apart, taking time to complain about how each other were poor servants of the king, wicked counsellors, or bad influences on him, that in the factions they were, at least on the surface, claiming that they wished to protect their king. They were criticising each other, sanctioning each other. They were not doing that to King Henry. And if we think about Henry's willingness to allow faction to flourish throughout his reign, and then go on to consider how that may have served to strengthen his rule and his power, is it possible that John Skelton, in part at least, taught Henry a lesson that would stay with him forever? So what do you think of John Skelton's life and legacy, of his influence on Henry as both pupil prince and patron king? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I would also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that does boost the engagement, and the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube does share it out, and that will help us to grow this community. As Skelton was both a scholar and a churchman, let's do an emoji that relates to one or both of those things. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all of the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. Indeed, if you like my channel, let some pals know about it. You can let me know that you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, have a little check now. Make sure that YouTube has not mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button, and then select all in the drop down that will appear, so that YouTube, they claim, will tell you both when I've next uploaded and also when I am next planning to go live, which I do, to talk about the history news. And I know that you are not going to want to miss that. Of course, we do now have our fail-safe. If you head over to my website, www.katrinamarchant.com, you will find the contact page. On the contact page, you can sign up for the mailing list. And if you are there, I will send all of the links that you could need once a week so you know what I'm up to. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing. And I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.